She got millions, I was left with nothing, until a secret letter changed my life forever. The rain hammered against the windows of the law office on Fifth Avenue, each drop echoing the hollow sound in Daniel's chest as he sat across from his family's attorney, Mr. Harrison. The mahogany desk that had once seemed so impressive now felt like a barrier between him and the life he thought he knew. 3 months had passed since his parents died in that horrific car accident on the interstate outside Albany. 3 months of grief, funeral arrangements, and the bitter taste of loss that never seemed to fade. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for this moment. Mr. Harrison cleared his throat, his weathered hands shuffling through documents that would forever change Daniel's understanding of his place in the world. The reading of the will was supposed to be a formality, a legal procedure before he and his sister Sarah could begin rebuilding their lives together. They had always been close, despite their 5-year age difference. Sarah, now 32, had been his anchor through their parents' final years when their father battled cancer and their mother's health declined from the stress. The attorney's voice cut through the silence like a blade. To my beloved daughter, Sarah Elizabeth Morrison, I leave the entirety of my estate, including all properties, investments, business holdings, and personal assets, valued at approximately $12 million. Daniel's world tilted. The words seemed to echo in slow motion, each syllable landing like a physical blow. $12 million. Their father's successful chain of hardware stores across upstate New York, the family home in Scarsdale, the vacation cabin in the Adirondacks, the investment portfolio their parents had built over 3 decades, all of it going to Sarah. He looked across the room where his sister sat, her designer handbag clutched in her lap, her face carefully composed. She wouldn't meet his eyes. That told him everything he needed to know. What about Daniel? He managed to ask, his voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Harrison's expression softened with what might have been pity. I'm afraid there's no provision for you in the will, Daniel. I'm sorry. The silence that followed was deafening. Daniel could hear his own heartbeat, the hum of the air conditioning, the distant sound of Manhattan traffic below. But he couldn't hear an explanation from Sarah, couldn't hear the words that would make this nightmare make sense. Growing up, Daniel had always felt like the outsider in his family. While Sarah excelled in school and charmed everyone she met, he struggled with dyslexia and social anxiety. His parents had been supportive, but distant, always seeming to connect more naturally with Sarah's achievements than with Daniel's quieter strengths. He'd worked in construction after high school, taking pride in building things with his hands, but he'd never felt like that impressed them the way Sarah's marketing degree and corporate success did. Still, he'd never imagined this. Complete disinheritance. As if 27 years of being their son meant nothing at all. After the meeting, Daniel followed Sarah out onto the rain-soaked street. The September air was crisp, carrying the scent of autumn leaves and exhaust fumes. New York City bustled around them, indifferent to the personal tragedy unfolding on its sidewalks. Sarah, we need to talk, he said, his voice hoarse. She finally looked at him, her green eyes so much like their mother's, filled with something Daniel couldn't quite read. Guilt? Relief? Determination? I'm sorry, Danny, I really am. But Mom and Dad made their choice. They knew I'd handle the money responsibly. Responsibly? The word came out harsher than he intended. What about family? What about taking care of each other? Sarah's face hardened. You've been struggling for years, Daniel. The gambling, the drinking after Lisa left you, the way you couldn't hold down a steady job. Mom and Dad were worried about you. Each word was like a slap. Yes, he'd gone through a rough patch after his divorce 2 years ago. Yes, he'd made mistakes. But he'd been getting his life back together, working steadily with a construction crew, staying sober for 8 months now. None of that seemed to matter. I would have shared it with you, he said quietly. If it had been the other way around, I would have made sure you were taken care of." Sarah's expression flickered for just a moment, and Daniel thought he saw his sister, the girl who used to build blanket forts with him and stay up late, reading comic books, peek through the corporate facade. But then the moment passed. "I have to go," she said, stepping toward the curb to hail a taxi. "I have a meeting with the financial advisor at 2. As the yellow cab pulled away, Daniel stood alone on the sidewalk, watching his sister disappear into the flow of Manhattan traffic. The rain had stopped, but the gray clouds overhead seemed to press down on him, like a weight he couldn't shake. The weeks that followed were the darkest of Daniel's life. He returned to his small apartment in Queens, a one-bedroom place above a bodega that smelled perpetually of coffee and cleaning products. The contrast between his cramped living space and the sprawling family home he'd grown up in felt even more stark, now that he knew he'd never be welcomed there again. Sarah had changed the locks within a week of the will reading. She'd hired a cleaning service to pack up what she called Daniel's personal items, a cardboard box containing his old baseball trophies, some childhood photos, and a few books. The message was clear. His childhood, his memories, his place in the family home were now reduced to a box that fit in the back of his pickup truck. The worst part wasn't the money, though the financial security would have changed his life. It was the betrayal, the realization that his parents had discussed this decision, probably for months or even years, and had concluded that he wasn't worthy of their trust or their love. That Sarah had known and said nothing. Daniel threw himself into work, taking on extra shifts with the construction crew, letting the physical exhaustion numb the emotional pain. His boss, Tony Castellano, was a third-generation Italian-American who'd built his small company through hard work and loyalty to his employees. Tony had noticed Daniel's increased dedication, but also his hollow eyes and the way he'd lost weight over the past month. "You okay, kid?" Tony asked one evening as they finished installing drywall in a new office building in Midtown. "You've been pushing yourself pretty hard lately." Daniel paused, his hand still gripping the edge of a drywall sheet. For a moment, he considered telling Tony everything. But the shame was too deep, the wound too fresh. "Just going through some family stuff," he said instead. Tony nodded, understanding in the way that comes from years of managing young men who carried their troubles quietly. "Family stuff's the hardest kind. But don't let it eat you alive, you. No, sometimes the family we choose matters more than the one we're born into." That night, Daniel sat in his kitchen with a bottle of whiskey on the table in front of him. He'd been sober for 8 months, but the temptation to escape into numbness was overwhelming. He thought about Sarah, probably in their parents' house right now, maybe redecorating their father's study or planning renovations with the unlimited budget her inheritance provided. He thought about their parents, about whether they'd ever really loved him or if he'd been some kind of burden they'd tolerated out of obligation. He thought about the life he'd imagined having, maybe starting his own construction business, buying a house, finding someone to share it with. All of that felt impossible now, not just because of the money, but because of what its absence represented. The bottle remained unopened, but just barely. Daniel stared at it until the sun came up, wrestling with demons that whispered that maybe his parents had been right about him. Maybe he was irresponsible. Maybe he was a failure. It was on a Tuesday morning, exactly 6 weeks after the will reading, that everything changed. Daniel was getting ready for work when he heard Mrs. Chun, the elderly woman who owned the bodega downstairs, calling his name from the street. "Daniel, mail for you." He'd been having his mail forwarded to the construction office to avoid dealing with condolence cards and legal notices, but occasionally something still arrived at his apartment. He expected another sympathy card from a distant relative, or maybe a bill he'd forgotten to redirect. Instead, Mrs. Chun handed him a manila envelope with no return address. His name was written in careful script that he didn't recognize. The postmark was from Albany, dated just 3 days ago. Daniel's hands trembled slightly as he opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of cream-colored paper, expensive. Stationery, the kind his mother used for formal correspondence. The letter was brief, but every word hit him like a revelation. Daniel, if you're reading this, then I am gone, and you have learned about the will. I know you must be confused and hurt, and I am sorry for that. But there are things you need to know, things I couldn't tell you while I was alive. You are not your father's biological son. Your mother and I kept this secret for 27 years, but you deserve to know the truth. Your biological father was a man named James Parker, who worked for my company in the early 1990s. He was a good man. Daniel, an engineer who died in an industrial accident when you were just 2 years old. James had no family of his own, but he had something else, a trust fund established by his grandfather, worth nearly $2 million. According to the terms of the trust, it passes to his biological children on their 30th birthday. You will turn 30 in 3 years. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you this myself, but I was afraid of how it might change our family. I loved you as my son, Daniel, even if I wasn't always good at showing it. Sarah doesn't know about this. I thought it best to keep it between us. The law firm of Parker and Associates in Albany has all the documentation you'll need. Ask for Margaret Parker. She's James's niece and the trustee of the fund. Use this knowledge wisely, son. And remember that your worth isn't measured in dollars, but in the good you do in this world. Love. Dad. Daniel read the letter 3 times before its contents fully sank in. His entire understanding of his identity, his family, his place in the world, all of it was shifting like sand beneath his feet. The man he'd called father for 27 years had loved him enough to keep this secret, to protect him from the complicated truth of his origins. But he'd also loved him enough to ensure Daniel would never be left with nothing. James Parker. The name felt foreign on his tongue, but it was his legacy. A man he'd never known, who died when Daniel was too young to remember him, had left him a gift that would change everything. $2 million. It wasn't 12 million, but it was independence. It was a chance to build something of his own, to prove that he was more than the struggling, irresponsible son his parents had apparently seen him as. Daniel looked at his reflection in the bathroom mirror, searching for traces of this stranger who was his biological father. He saw his own dark hair, his angular jaw, the brown eyes that had never quite matched his parents' features. Had he gotten those from James Parker? Had the man who'd given him life also given him the stubborn determination that had kept him going through the darkest weeks of his life? For the first time in 6 weeks, Daniel felt something other than despair. He felt purpose. The rain had started again outside, but this time it sounded different. Not like the hollow drumming of loss, but like the fresh beginning of something new. Daniel carefully folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope. He had a construction job to finish, but after that, he had a phone call to make to Albany. And then he had a life to rebuild, not as the son who'd been cast aside, but as the man who'd found his own way forward. The drive to Albany took Daniel through the Hudson Valley, past rolling hills painted in the brilliant oranges and reds of early October. He'd called in sick to work for the first time in 2 years, but Tony had been understanding when Daniel explained he had important family business to handle. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was finally dealing with family business, just not the family he'd grown up with. Margaret Parker's law office occupied the 2nd floor of a Victorian house that had been converted into professional suites. The building sat on a tree-lined street near the state capitol, its brick facade covered in ivy that had turned deep crimson with the changing season. Daniel had spoken to Margaret twice on the phone since receiving the letter, but meeting her in person felt surreal. She was a woman in her mid-50s with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. When she shook Daniel's hand, he noticed her grip was firm and her smile genuine. "You have your father's eyes," she said, leading him into her office. "I was hoping I'd get to meet you someday." though I wish it had been under different circumstances. The office was warm and welcoming, with photographs of the Parker family scattered across the built-in bookshelves. Margaret gestured to a framed photo on her desk, a young man in his 20s wearing a hard hat and work clothes, standing in front of what looked like a construction site. "That's your father, James. This was taken about a year before he died. He was working on a bridge project upstate." Daniel studied the photograph intently. The resemblance was unmistakable, the same dark hair, the same angular features, even the same way of holding his shoulders. But more than that, there was something familiar in James Parker's expression, a quiet confidence that Daniel recognized in himself. "What was he like?" Daniel asked. Margaret's expression softened. "He was one of the most genuinely good people I've ever known. Smart, hardworking, but never arrogant about it. He cared about doing things the right way, even when it was harder, or took longer. And he had this way of seeing the best in people, even when they couldn't see it in themselves." She pulled out a thick file folder and spread its contents across her desk. The trust fund was established by James's grandfather in 1923. He was a successful railroad engineer who wanted to ensure his family would always have opportunities. James was the last of his line till now. The documentation was overwhelming. Bank statements, investment records, legal documents that traced the Parker family financial history back nearly a century. The trust had been carefully managed, growing steadily over the decades through conservative investments and compound interest. "The current value is just over $2.1 million, Margaret explained. "It's been invested in a diversified portfolio of stocks, bonds, and real estate investments. On your 30th birthday, you'll have full access to the principal. Until then, you can access the investment income, which has been accumulating for the past 3 years." Daniel's head spun with the numbers. The accumulated income alone was nearly $200,000. More money than he'd ever imagined having access to. "There's something else," Margaret continued, reaching for another folder. "James left some personal items in storage here. I've been waiting for the right time to share them with you." She led him to a small storage room behind her office, where several boxes sat on metal shelving. The largest box contained photo albums, documenting James Parker's life from childhood through his early 30s. Daniel found himself staring at pictures of a man who looked increasingly like him as the years progressed. There were photos of James in college, graduating with an engineering degree. Pictures of him with friends, at work sites, on hiking trips in the Adirondacks. But what struck Daniel most were the photos of James with his mother, Carol. They were clearly in love, clearly happy together. In one photo, James had his arms around Carol, and she was laughing at something he'd whispered in her ear. Daniel had never seen his mother look so carefree, so genuinely joyful. "They were planning to get married," Margaret said quietly. James had already bought a ring. He was going to propose on her birthday, but the accident happened 2 weeks before. Daniel found the ring box in the bottom of the storage container. Inside was a simple but elegant diamond solitaire, still beautiful after all these years. He imagined James Parker saving up for this ring, planning the perfect proposal, dreaming of the life he'd build with Carol and their son. "Your mother was devastated when James died," Margaret continued. "She was pregnant with you and completely alone. When Robert Morrison offered to marry her and give you his name, she thought it was the best thing for everyone. Robert was a good man, Daniel. He knew the truth about your parentage from the beginning, but he chose to raise you as his own son." The revelation recontextualized everything Daniel thought he knew about his childhood. Robert Morrison hadn't been his distant, disapproving father. He'd been a man trying to love a child who reminded him every day that the woman he'd married had loved someone else first. The awkwardness Daniel had always felt in their relationship suddenly made sense. "Did Sarah know?" Daniel asked. Margaret shook her head. Your mother and Robert decided to keep it between themselves. They thought it would be easier if you and Sarah grew up as full siblings. It wasn't until Robert got sick that he started questioning that decision. Daniel spent the rest of the afternoon going through James Parker's belongings. There were books on engineering and construction, tools from his trade, and a journal that documented his thoughts and dreams for the future. One entry, dated just months before his death, made Daniel's throat tighten. Carol is getting bigger every day, and I can't wait to meet our son. I've been thinking about what kind of father I want to be. I want to teach him to build things, to take pride in honest work, to treat people with respect. I want him to know that success isn't about how much money you make, but about how much good you do in the world. I hope I get the chance to show him that. The words felt like a message across time, a father's wishes for a son he'd never get to know. Daniel realized that in many ways, he'd already become the man James Parker had hoped he would be. He'd found pride in honest work. He'd learned to build things with his hands, and despite his struggles, he'd always tried to treat people with respect. On the drive back to Queens, Daniel's mind raced with possibilities. $2 million was life-changing money, but it was also a tremendous responsibility. He thought about his biological father's words in the journal, about success being measured in the good you do in the world rather than the money you accumulate. By the time he reached his apartment, Daniel knew what he wanted to do. The next morning, he called Tony Castellano and asked for a meeting. They sat in Tony's cluttered office, surrounded by blueprints and invoices, while Daniel explained his situation, carefully omitting the more complicated family details. "I want to start my own construction company," Daniel said. "But not just any company. I want to focus on affordable housing, maybe some commercial projects that actually help the community. Places like schools, community centers, things that matter." Tony leaned back in his chair, studying Daniel's face. "You know how hard it is to run a business, especially in this market. You'd be competing against established companies with decades of experience." "I know. But I've got some capital to work with, and I've learned a lot working for you. I'm not talking about trying to take over Manhattan. I'm thinking about starting small, maybe upstate, in communities that need good, honest construction work." Tony was quiet for a long moment. Then he smiled. "You know what? I think you might actually pull this off. You've got the skills, and more importantly, you've got the right attitude. If you need any advice or help getting started, you know where to find me." Daniel spent the following weeks researching the construction industry, studying business plans, and exploring potential locations for his new company. He found himself drawn to the small towns of upstate New York, communities that had been struggling economically but were starting to show signs of renewal. He settled on a town called Millbrook, about 2 hours north of New York City. It was the kind of place where James Parker might have worked, where a young construction company could make a real difference. The town needed infrastructure improvements, affordable housing, and someone who understood that building wasn't just about profit margins, it was about creating spaces where people could live and thrive. Daniel used part of his inheritance to buy a small office building in Millbrook's historic downtown, and to purchase the equipment he'd need to get started. He hired 3 employees initially, all of them experienced workers who'd been laid off from larger companies during the economic downturn. But perhaps the most important thing he did was establish the James Parker Foundation, a nonprofit organization that would provide low-cost housing repairs for elderly residents and fund construction training programs for young people in the community. It was his way of honoring his biological father's memory while creating something meaningful with the gift he'd been given. 3 months after receiving the letter that changed his life, Daniel stood in the foundation's new headquarters, watching his employees install the sign that would announce their presence to the community. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of wood smoke and falling leaves. For the first time in years, Daniel felt truly at peace. His phone buzzed with a text message from Sarah. "Heard through the grapevine that you started a business. Congratulations. Maybe we can talk soon?" Daniel stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back, "Thanks, I'd like that." He wasn't ready to forgive Sarah completely, and he might never be ready to share the truth about his parentage. But he was ready to move forward, to build something positive from the ashes of his old life. The anger and bitterness that had consumed him for months were finally beginning to fade, replaced by a sense of purpose he'd never experienced before. As the sun set over the mountains surrounding Millbrook, Daniel walked through the town's main street, past the diner where he'd become a regular customer, past the hardware store where he'd bought his first supplies, past the community center where he'd soon be teaching construction skills to local teenagers. He thought about James Parker, the father he'd never known but whose legacy had saved him. He thought about Robert Morrison, the man who'd raised him, despite the complicated circumstances of his birth. He thought about his mother, who'd made impossible choices in impossible circumstances, trying to do what she thought was best for everyone. Most of all, he thought about the future he was building, not just for himself, but for the community he was now part of. The inheritance had given him financial security, but it had also given him something more valuable: the chance to prove that his worth wasn't measured by what others thought of him, but by what he chose to do with the gifts he'd been given. Daniel's phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was Margaret Parker. "I wanted to let you know that the trust transfer is complete," she said. "Congratulations, Daniel. Your father would be very proud of what you're building." As Daniel hung up the phone, he looked up at the mountains surrounding his new home and smiled. He'd lost one family, but he'd found another in the memory of a father he'd never known, in the community he was now serving, and in the future he was building one day at a time. The letter that had arrived on that dark Tuesday morning had indeed changed his life forever, but not in the way he'd initially imagined. It hadn't just given him money, it had given him identity, purpose, and the chance to become the man he was meant to be. The end.
Thank you for watching this story unfold with us here on M&A The Story Unfolds. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new tale. We'd love to know where you're watching. Leave a comment below and tell us what part of the world you're joining us from. Your support means everything. See you in the next story.